Daenerys. Daenerys Targaryen wed Khal Drogo with fear and barbaric splendor in a field beyond the walls of Pentos, for the Dothraki believed that all things of importance in a man's life must be done beneath the open sky. Drogo had called his 𝘕𝘼𝘼 to attend him, and they had come, 40,000 Dothraki warriors and uncounted numbers of women, children, and slaves. Outside the city walls, they camped with their vast herds, raising palaces of woven grass, eating everything in sight, and making the good folk of Pentos more anxious with every passing day. My fellow magisters have doubled the size of the city guard, Illyrio told them over platters of honey duck and orange snap peppers one night at the manse that had been Drogo's. The Khal had joined his 𝘕𝘼𝘼, his estate given over to Daenerys and her brother until the wedding.
Best we get Princess Daenerys wedded quickly before they hand half the wealth of Pentos away to sell swords and bravos.
Sir Jorah Mormont jested. The exile had offered her brother his sword the night Dany had been sold to Khal Drogo. Viserys had accepted eagerly. Mormont had been their constant companion ever since. Magister Illyrio laughed lightly through his forked beard, but Viserys did not so much as smile. He can come and have her tomorrow if he likes, her brother said. He glanced over at Dany, and she lowered her eyes. So long as he pays the price. Illyrio waved a languid hand in the air, rings glittering on his fat fingers. I have told you, all is settled. Trust me. The Khal has promised you a crown, and you shall have it. Yes, but when? When the Khal chooses, Illyrio said. He will have the girl first, and after they are wed, he must make his procession across the plains and present her to the Dosh Khaleen at Vaes Dothrak. After that, perhaps, if the omens favor war. Viserys seethed with impatience. I piss on Dothraki omens. The usurper sits on my father's throne. How long must I wait? Illyrio gave a massive shrug. You have waited most of your life, great king. What is another few months? Another few years? Sir Jorah, who had traveled as far east as Vaes Dothrak, nodded in agreement. I counsel you to be patient, your grace. The Dothraki are true to their word, but they do things in their own time. A lesser man may beg a favor from the Khal, but must never presume to berate him. Viserys bristled. Guard your tongue, Mormont, or I'll have it. I am no lesser man. I am the rightful lord of the 7 kingdoms. The dragon does not beg. Sir Jorah lowered his eyes respectfully. Illyrio smiled enigmatically and tore a wing from the duck. Honey and grease ran over his fingers and dripped down into his beard as he nibbled at the tender meat. There are no more dragons, Dany thought, staring at her brother, though she did not dare say it aloud. Yet that night she dreamt of one. Viserys was hurting her. She was naked, clumsy with fear. She ran from him, but her body seemed thick and ungainly. He struck her again. She stumbled and fell. You woke the dragon, he screamed as he kicked her. You woke the dragon. You woke the dragon. Her thighs were slick with blood. She closed her eyes and whimpered. As if in answer, there was a hideous, ripping sound and the crackling of some great fire. When she looked again, Viserys was gone. Great columns of flame rose all around, and in the midst of them was the dragon. It turned its great head slowly. When its molten eyes found hers, she woke, shaking and covered with a sheen sleek of sweat. She had never been so afraid until the day of the wedding came at last. The ceremony began at dawn and continued until dusk, an endless day of drinking and feasting and fighting. A mighty earthen ramp had been raised amid the grass palaces, and there Dany was seated beside Khal Drogo above the seething sea of Dothraki. She had never seen so many people in one place, nor people so strange and frightening. The horse lords might put on rich fabrics and sweet perfumes when they visited the free cities, but out under the open sky they kept the old ways. Men and women alike wore painted leather vests over bare chests and horsehair leggings cinched by bronze medallion belts, and the warriors greased their long beards with fat from the rendering pits. They gorged themselves on horse flesh roasted with honey and peppers, drank themselves blind on fermented mare's milk and Illyrio's fine wines, and spat jests at each other across the fires, their voices harsh and alien in Dany's ears. Viserys was seated just below her, splendid in a new black wool tunic, with a scarlet dragon on the chest. Illyrio and Ser Jorah sat beside him. Theirs was a place of high honor, just below the cow's own blood riders, but Dany could see the anger in her brother's lilac eyes. He did not like sitting beneath her, and he fumed when the slaves offered each dish first to the cow and his bride, and served him from the portions they refused. He could do nothing but nurse his resentment, so nurse he did, this mood growing blacker by the hour at each insult to his person. Dany had never felt so alone as she did seated in the midst of that vast horde. Her brother had told her to smile, and so she smiled until her face ached and the tears came unbidden to her eyes. She did her best to hide them, knowing how angry Viserys would be if he saw her crying, terrified of how Khal Drogo might react. Food was brought to her, steaming joints of meat and thick black sausages and Dothraki blood pies, and later fruits and sweetgrass stews and delicate pastries from the kitchens of Pentos, but she waved it all away. Her stomach was a roll, and she knew she could keep none of it down. There was no one to talk to. Khal Drogo shouted commands and jests down to his blood riders, and laughed at their replies, but he scarcely glanced at Dany beside him. They had no common language. Dothraki was incomprehensible to her, and the Khal knew only a few words of the bastard Valyrian of the free cities, and none at all of the common tongue of the Seven Kingdoms. She would even have welcomed the conversation of Illyrio and her brother, but they were too far below to hear her. She sat in her wedding silks, nursing a cup of honeyed wine, afraid to eat, talking silently to herself. "I am blood of the dragon," she told herself. "I am Daenerys Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, of the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror." The sun was only a quarter of the way up the sky when she saw her first man die. Drums were beating as some of the women danced for the Khal. Drogo watched without expression, but his eyes followed their movements, and from time to time he would toss down a bronze medallion for the women to fight over. The warriors were watching too. One of them finally stepped into the circle, grabbed a dancer by the arm, pushed her to the ground, and mounted her right there as a stallion mount. Illyrio had told her that might happen. "The Dothraki mate like the animals in their herds. There is no privacy in a 𝘕𝘼𝑒𝑟, and they do not understand sin or shame as we do." Dany looked away from the coupling, frightened when she realized what was happening, but a second warrior stepped forward, and a third, and soon there was no way to avert her eyes. Then two men seized the same woman. She heard a shout, saw a shove. In the blink of an eye, the 𝘉𝘉 were out. Long, razor-sharp blades, half sword and half scythe. A dance of death began as the warriors circled and slashed, leaping toward each other, whirling the blades around their heads, shrieking insults at each other. No one made a move to interfere. It ended as quickly as it began. The 𝘉𝘉 shivered together faster than Dany could follow. One man missed a step. The other swung his blade in a flat arc. Steel bit into flesh just above the Dothraki's waist and opened him from backbone to belly button, spilling his entrails into the dust. As the loser died, the winner took hold of the nearest woman, not even the one they had been quarreling over, and had her there and then. Slaves carried off the body, and the dancing resumed. Magister Illyrio had warned Dany about this too. "A Dothraki wedding without at least 3 deaths is deemed a dull affair," he had said. Her wedding must have been especially blessed. Before the day was over, 12 men had died. As the hours passed, the terror grew in Dany until it was all She was afraid of the 𝘕𝘲𝘰𝘠, whose ways seemed alien and monstrous, as if they were beasts in human skins and not men at all. She was afraid of her brother, of what might he do if she failed him. Most of all, she was afraid of what would happen tonight under the stars when her brother gave her up to the hulking giant who sat beside her drinking with a face as still and cruel as a bronze mask. "I am the blood of the dragon," she told herself again. When at last the sun was low in the sky, Khal Drogo clapped his hands together, and the drums and the shouting and feasting came to a sudden halt. Drogo stood and pulled Dany to her feet beside him. It was time for her to bride gifts. And after the gifts, she knew, after the sun had gone down, it would be time for the first ride in the consummation of her marriage. Dany tried to put the thought aside, but it would not leave her. She hugged herself to try to keep from shaking. Her brother Viserys gifted her with 3 handmaids. Dany knew they had cost him nothing. Illyrio had no doubt that he provided the girls. 𝘰𝘠𝘬𝘠 and 𝘕𝘠𝘬𝘠 were copper-skinned 𝘕𝘲𝘰𝘠 with black hair and almond-shaped eyes. 𝘕𝘰𝘠, a fair-haired, blue-eyed 𝘕𝘠𝑚 girl. "These are no common servants, sweet sister," her brother told her as they were brought forward one by one. "Illyrio and I selected them personally for you. 𝘰𝘠𝘬 will teach you riding, 𝘕𝘠𝘬𝘠 the Dothraki tongue, and 𝘕𝘰𝘠 will instruct you in the womanly arts of love." He smiled thinly. "She's very good. Illyrio and I both can swear to that." Sir Jorah Mormont apologized for his gift. "It is a small thing, my princess, but all a poor exile could afford," he said as he laid a small stack of old books before her. They were histories and songs of the 7 kingdoms, she saw, written in the common tongue. She thanked him with all her heart. Magister Illyrio murmured a command, and 4 burly slaves hurried forward, bearing between them a great cedar chest bound in bronze. When she opened it, she found piles of the finest velvets and damasks. Let's try that again. When she opened it, she found piles of the finest velvets and damask the free city could produce, and resting on top, nested in the soft cloth, 3 huge eggs. Dany gasped. They were the most beautiful things she had ever seen, each different than the others, patterned in such rich colors that at first she thought they were crusted with jewels, and so large it took both of her hands to hold one. She lifted it delicately, expecting that it would be made of some fine porcelain or delicate enamel, or even blown glass, but it was much heavier than that, as if it were all of solid stone. The surface of the shell was covered with tiny scales, and she turned the egg between her fingers. They shimmered like polished metal in the light of the setting sun. One egg was a deep green with burnished bronze flecks that came and went depending on how Dany turned it. Another was pale cream streaked with gold. The last was black as a midnight sea, yet alive with scarlet ripples and swirls. "What are they?" she asked, her voice hushed and full of wonder. "Dragon eggs from the shadow lands beyond 𝘕𝘲𝘠," said Maester Illyrio. "The eons have turned them to stone, yet still they burn bright with beauty." "I shall treasure them always." Dany had heard tales of such eggs, but she had never seen one, nor thought to see one. It was a truly magnificent gift, though she knew that Illyrio could afford to be lash. He had collected a fortune in horses and slaves for his part in selling her to Khal Drogo. The Khal's blood riders offered her the traditional 3 weapons, and splendid weapons they were. Hagel gave her a great leather whip with a silver handle, 𝘕𝘁𝘠𝘠, a magnificent 𝘕𝘁𝘠, chased in gold, and 𝘕𝘁𝘠, a double-curved dragon bone bow taller than she was. Maester Illyrio and Ser Jorah had taught her the traditional refusals for these offerings. "This is a gift worthy of a great warrior, O blood of my blood, and I am but a woman. Let my lord husband bear these in my stead." And so Khal Drogo too received his bride's gifts. Other gifts she was given in plenty by other Dothraki: slippers and jewels and silver rings for her hair, medallion belts and painted vests and soft furs, sand silks and jars of scent, needles and feathers and tiny bottles of purple glass, and a gown made from the skin of 1,000 mice. "A handsome gift, Khaleesi," Maester Illyrio said of the last, after he had told her what it was. "Most lucky." The gifts mounted up around her in great piles, more gifts than she could possibly imagine, more gifts than she could ever want or use. And at last, Khal Drogo brought forth his own bride gift to her. An expected hush rippled out from the center of the camp as he left her side, growing until he had swallowed the whole Khalasar. When he returned, the dense press of Dothraki gift-givers parted before him, and he led the horse to her. She was a young filly, spirited and splendid. Dany knew just enough about horses to know that this was no ordinary animal. There was something about her that took the breath away. She was gray as the winter sea, with a mane like silver smoke. Hesitantly, she reached out and stroked the horse's neck, ran her fingers through the silver of her mane. Khal Drogo said something in Dothraki, and Maester Illyrio translated. silver, for the silver of your hair, the 𝘕𝘼 says. She's beautiful, Dany murmured. She is the pride of the 𝘕𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑟, Illyrio said. Custom decrees that the 𝘕𝑠𝑖 must ride a mount worthy of her place by the side of her 𝘕. Drogo stepped forward and put his hands on her waist. He lifted her up as easily as if she were a child and set her on the thin Dothraki saddle, so much smaller than the ones she was used to. Dany sat there, uncertain for a moment. No one had told her about this part. What shall I do? She asked Illyrio. It was Sir Jorah Mormont who answered. Take the reins and ride. You need not go far. Nervously, Dany gathered the reins in her hands and slid her feet into the short stirrups. She was only a fair rider. She had spent far more time traveling by ship and wagon and palanquin than by horseback. Praying that she would not fall off and disgrace herself, she gave the filly the lightest and most timid touch with her knees. And for the first time in hours, she forgot to be afraid, or perhaps it was the first time ever. The silver-gray filly moved with a smooth and silken gait, and the crowd parted for her, every eye upon them. Dany found herself moving faster than she had intended, yet somehow it was exciting rather than terrifying. The horse broke into a trot, and she smiled. Dothraki scrambled to clear a path. The slightest pressure with her legs, the slightest touch on the reins, and the filly responded. She sent it in a gallop, and now the Dothraki were hooting and laughing and shouting at her as they jumped out of her way. As she turned to ride back, a fire pit loomed ahead, directly in her path. They were hemmed in one side and then another, with no room to stop. A daring she had never known filled Daenerys then, and she gave the filly her head. The silver horse leapt the flames as if it had wings. When she pulled up before Magister Illyrio, she said, Tell Khal Drogo that he has given me the wind. The fat Pentoshi stroked his yellow beard as he repeated her words in Dothraki, and Dany saw her new husband smile for the first time. The last sliver of sun vanished behind the high walls of Pentos to the west just then. Dany had lost all track of time. Khal Drogo commanded his blood riders to bring forth his own horse, a lean red stallion. As the 𝘕 was saddling the horse, Viserys slid close to Dany on her silver, dug his fingers into her leg, and said, Please him, sweet sister, or I swear you will see the dragon wake as it has never woken before. The fear came back to her then, with her brother's words. She felt like a child once more, only 13 and all alone, not ready for what was about to happen to her. They rode out together as the stars came out, leaving the 𝘕𝑒𝑒𝑟 and the grass palace behind. I'm so sorry. Didn't mean to boop you. Khal Drogo spoke no word to her, but drove his stallion at a hard trot through the gathering dusk. The tiny silver bells in his long braid sang softly as he rode. "I am the blood of the dragon," she whispered aloud as she followed, trying to keep her courage up. "I am the blood of the dragon. I am the blood of the dragon." The dragon was never afraid. Afterward, she could not say how far or how long they had ridden, but it was full dark when they stopped at a grassy place beside a small stream. Drogo swung off his horse and lifted her down from hers. She felt as fragile as glass in his hands, her limbs as weak as water. She stood there, helpless and trembling in her wedding silks, while he secured the horses, and when he turned to look at her, she began to cry. Khal Drogo stared at her eyes, his face strangely empty of expression. "No," he said. He lifted his hand and rubbed away the tears roughly with a calloused thumb. "You speak the common tongue," Dany said in wonder. "No," he said again. Perhaps he had only that, but it was one word more than she had known he had, and somehow it made her feel a little better. Drogo touched her hair lightly, sliding the silver blonde strands between his fingers and murmuring softly in Dothraki. Dany did not understand the words, yet there was warmth in the tone and a tenderness she had never expected from this man. He put his finger under her chin and lifted her head, so she was looking up into his eyes. Drogo towered over her as he towered over everyone. Taking her lightly under the arms, he lifted her and seated her on a rounded rock beside the stream. Then he sat on the ground facing her, legs crossed beneath him, their faces finally at a height. "No," he said. "Is that the only word you know?" she asked him. Drogo did not reply. His long, heavy braid was coiled in the dirt beside him. He pulled it over his right shoulder and began to remove the bells from his hair, one by one. After a moment, Dany leaned forward to help. When they were done, Drogo gestured. She understood. Slowly, carefully, she began to undo his braid. It took a long time. All the while, he sat there silently, watching her. When she was done, he shook his head, and his hair spread out behind him like a river of darkness, oiled and gleaming. She had never seen hair so long, so black, so thick. Then it was his turn. He began to undress her. His fingers were deft and strangely tender. He removed her silks, one by one, carefully, while Dany sat, unmoving, silent, looking at his eyes. When he bared her small breasts, She could not help herself. She averted her eyes and covered herself with her hands.
No,
Drago said. He pulled her hands away from her breasts, gently but firmly, then lifted her face again to make her look at him.
No,
he repeated. No. She echoed back at him. He stood her up then and pulled her close to remove the last of her silks. The night air was chilly on her bare skin. She shivered, and goose flesh covered her arms and legs. She was afraid of what would come next, but for a while nothing happened. Khal Drogo sat with his legs crossed, looking at her, drinking in her body with his eyes. After a while, he began to touch her, lightly at first, then harder. She could sense the fierce strength in his hands, but he never hurt her. He held her hand in his own and brushed her fingers, one by one. He ran a hand gently down her leg. He stroked her face, tracing the curve of her ears, running a finger gently around her mouth. He put both hands in her hair and combed it with his fingers. He turned her around, massaged her shoulders, slid a knuckle down the path of her spine. It seemed as if hours passed before his hands finally went to her breasts. He stroked the soft skin underneath. He circled her nipples with his thumbs, pinched them between the finger and thumb, then began to pull at her, very lightly at first, then more insistently until her nipples stiffened and began to ache. He stopped then and drew her down onto his lap. Dany was flushed and breathless, her heart fluttering in her chest. He cupped her face in his large hands, and she looked into his eyes.
No,
he said, and she knew it was a question. She took his hand and moved it down to the wetness between her thighs. Yes, she whispered as he put his finger inside her.